Hi everyone, it's a day since the Ayodhya verdict came out, and there are two big emotions that have accompanied the verdict, one of extreme relief and certain anxieties. The first big one is relief. That comes out of the fact that there has been such a peaceful reaction to the verdict. The rhetoric from all parties involved and their associate organizations have largely been conciliatory, no matter what the undertones are and how we analyze those undertones. But overall, there is a sense that people have accepted the rule of law and the country at large has moved on. Whereas, smaller groups may be very invested in the dialogue still, there is a certain sense that by and large, people of India have moved on, they have reconciled with the ideas of faith within themselves, and that it is not geographically located in some sort of, location or political dialogue. But having said that, the verdict itself has created a lot of debate, and fairly, because what was at stake were very, very big civilizational ideas, and what the judges had to give a judgment on were very complex. At the heart of it is the idea of how religion can play itself out in a secular democracy. This debate got complicated by 1992 and the demolition of the mosque, which was a criminal act. And the aftermath of that has made it difficult to really look at the core issue in a clear fashion. So no matter what the verdict, one looks, for instance, if it had gone to the side of the Muslims, it would have been as conflagratory. But the fact that today it has gone to the Hindus is complicated by the fact that there was a political organization that criminally demolished a mosque. So we have to first of all separate these two issues, because the case about the criminal demolition of the mosque is a separate case, and one hopes that there will be a very, very stern judgment on that. So if we set that apart, we have to really look at the idea of how ideas of faith can play themselves out in a secular democracy. In that too, the judgment is very complicated, because what was put to the court was really the question of ownership of land, the title of land. And that again is a very complicated thing, because the historical ownership of the land goes back much before 1947 and actually predates Mir Bakr and Babur, where one imagines the real dispute began. So it is, while there are time-bound limitations, while there is a kind of temporal frame within which courts can give their judgment, but people's belief and faith do go back and do predate these sort of, artificial temporal frames. So it was a very complicated thing to look at. What the judgment has now come has been criticized as being a sort of panchayati settlement, and perhaps it is that, because they were really looking for something that was a settlement rather than a judgment on points of law. If they had really stuck to the legal frame, perhaps a better route would have been to say that it is quite evident from contemporary history that Hindus and Muslims have both possessed this land, and because there is a joint possession, it is impossible to decipher who owns this land, and so it should be divided up. That perhaps would have been a more tenable position. But what they did do, and what is amazing, is that all three judges with differing vocabulary did admit that there was some structure before the mosque came up. They all believe it was some sort of a Hindu structure. One of the judges, Mr. Khan, believes that that Hindu structure was not pulled down to create the mosque. And so that is a very important tenet for Islam, because they believe that mosques cannot be set up by demolishing some other religious structure. So having said that, perhaps the wiser route would have been to give joint possession and then suggest that it be split three ways. Today there's a lot of criticism about the splitting of three ways, but that panchayati justice has been the most wise decision the court could take, because it has really taken the wind out of everyone's sails. It also allows one to appeal, because actually it leaves nobody happy. Nobody has got it, and in some intrinsic way, it suggests the fabric of India, which is of sharing and of conciliatory coexistence. The really difficult part of the judgment is the ruling on faith. Just as an ordinary Indian citizen, and I would say this on either side, whether it was a Christian issue of faith, whether it was a Hindu issue of faith, or whether it was a Muslim issue of faith, faith plays a very, very big part in people's lives. Why the issue of Ayodhya and Ram has been so vexed is because it is a central civilizational story. Let's forget the divinity of it, let's forget the religious aspects of it. First of all, it is a central civilizational story. It is a story that everybody imbibes, whether at the level of story, whether at the level of faith, or whether at the level of divinity. So to have a dispute over that central idea, when the opposing idea is really a mosque that was created perhaps by an invading army, certainly not something that is central to the idea of Islam itself. It was an unequal debate in many ways, and it would have been much wiser for community elders to have discussed this and outside the framework of a court settled that it is more important for one community's belief than another community's belief, and so perhaps one community gives way on this. That, to my mind, and me being a secular Indian, not very invested in matters of faith, would perhaps have been the greater way of dealing with this. What makes it complicated is that when the court has ruled on this, many people have looked at it as an act of courage, and perhaps it is, but it does set a very difficult precedent, because matters of faith are not meant to be adjudicated on just belief. You know, here, if you just set up that people believe and so we must give, sets a precedent where in the years to come, if there are any troublemakers who again want to drum up a sense of belief and, you know, extreme rhetoric around any idea of faith, and this is a precedent that just because a certain group of people believe, we must then set aside all ideas of jurisprudence to give in to that idea of belief. It is a dangerous precedent. I mean, you know, like I was saying to some Hindu groups that I spoke to yesterday, and when I say Hindu groups, I mean the political organization of Hindus, Hindutva groups. I said that, you know, are you not yourself a little worried about this? Because what are you bequeathing to generations to come? That if somebody now sits up and says, I believe that under Taj Mahal, Ganesha was born, are we going to start breaking down the Taj Mahal? So it is a difficult precedent. I don't think that younger generations are ever really going to take up issues like this. And we must ensure that we create a society where people are less and less invested in issues of faith in this sort of a way. But there is cause for alarm around that aspect of the judgment. What is true is that the appeal remains and people will go to the Supreme Court because, as I said, no party is really satisfied with this. What it has shown is that even out of the courts, the only approach can be one of conciliation and actually a sense of settlement, a sense of negotiation. It really cannot be a black and white judgment. In that way, I think this verdict has been wise. The fact that the country has received it in the way it has been wise. We have all praised the Hindutva groups for not being over celebratory, for not raising the notch of the rhetoric too much. They have said, we accept the word of law, you know, we will reach out to our Muslim brothers to create conversation. But there is a caveat I want to put here, which is that these very groups must ask themselves that had the judgment gone the other way, which it well could have, if it had gone that the title property belongs to the Sunni Waqf board, but still the land must be divided up 3 ways, would the Hindutva groups have still shown this sagacious acceptance of the word of law? Would they have still kept the rhetoric peaceful? Today, there is a great degree of dignity and calm coming out of the Muslim community, where yes, they do speak of disappointment, they speak of a sense of betrayal, but it again has been that we will go to the Supreme Court. All the litigants have first of all said that they accept the verdict. So these are extremely wise signs in our society, some things that we must be grateful for. And one hopes that this case will go to the Supreme Court, it will come back with a more refined judgment, but I reiterate that there must be a sense of negotiated settlement. The panchayat, we might say derogatorily, but it is the rudimentary, the foundational stone of how justice is meted out, where communities come together and understand where there must be some give and where there must be some take. Before I finish, there's one other complication that I'd like to address, which is that in many ways the disquiet around this judgment is that it seems to ratify the fact that Ramlala deity idols were put into the temple or into the mosque at that time in 1949, and this judgment seems to endorse the fact that you know, that is something that has been there from time immemorial, whereas it really was something that was an act of intrusion. But having said that, and I think that that again is a complication that one needs to look at and one needs to address. Having said that, I again want to sort of pull the telescope back to the idea that, you know, while it is almost foolish to try and endorse that Ram was born historically or mythically in this exact spot, it's not even true that all Hindus believe that. And you know, so the exact geographic location of trying to identify this is where God was born is perhaps a futile exercise and perhaps a foolish exercise. But having said that, the idea of Ayodhya, both as a mythical landscape And then the beauty of having a geographical landscape that is also called Ayodhya is a very, very powerful symbol. And the need to protect that just in the psyche of a society as I was saying earlier, a story or as a religious construct or as a mythical construct is an important one. And you know, it has been ingrained in people for centuries that Ram and Ayodhya are inextricably linked. So as I said, it was an unequal fight in terms of faith and in terms of belief. But to geographically pin it down as being this is the birthplace of Ram, and so you know, to give the intrusion of those Ramlala idols that kind of sanctity is again in point of law a difficult thing to have done. But again, to point out the complexity for the judges, it would have been very difficult to rule that remove these deities, because by having put the deities there, although it may in many ways have been a criminal act or an act of intrusion, because of the power of the story, it has accrued a sense of force. And so now to have removed it legally would have been in many ways a conflagratory thing. So again, I come back to the point that issues of faith in a secular democracy must be talked largely by wise community elders outside the framework of law, and it should be done in a spirit of conciliation. We have to look forward to elders who will not lead these conversations in the way that it was done in the 90s or in the 80s, when very often the people of Ayodhya themselves said that if outsiders were not involved in the argument, they would have come to a settlement, because Hindus and Muslims have lived in peace there for many, many, many hundreds of years. But it was the intrusion of outsiders, and when I say outsiders, one doesn't mean it as people who don't have a right to speak on these issues, but who brought another set of expectations and desires into what was essentially a conversation about faith. And that is what has complicated this thing so much. Let's see how this plays out in the months and years to come.